Imagine this. A beautiful thing catches your eye. You turn and appreciate what you see and enjoy it fully. It makes you smile.
Imagine this. A beautiful thing catches your eye. You turn and appreciate what you see and enjoy it fully. It makes you smile. As you heard this, you probably started to play something out in your mind in some way. Did your scenario change with a woman's voice versus a man's voice? Did you put them in different situations? Did you apply a context to something without knowing all the details? Think about this as we launch out into the loop and discuss contextual awareness today on Curiosity Continuum. Hey everybody, this is Brian.
And this is Josh.
Thank you for joining us today on Curiosity Continuum. For those of you tuning in for the first time, Curiosity Continuum is a podcast and movement started by two lifelong friends, myself, Brian, and my best friend Josh, who want to share conversations with you that explore, examine, and reframe common practical topics that will spark your curiosity and help you integrate information and enhance your everyday contextual awareness in a constantly changing world.
So where you guys can find us, I know a lot of people have been asking, so here's where we're going to find us. CuriosityContinuum.com. From there, you can listen to us right from there. You can click on, you can follow us on social media. You can interact, and you also rate us on those on social media and wherever you are listening to us too. It helps us find a new audience, so please do that.
This podcast is successful because of your listening ears and your contributions, and we thank you for everything that you are providing for us by keeping this conversation going between us all. So today, the title is Contextual Awareness. Now, this is part of our kind of our opening statement that we give at the front of every podcast. We want to talk about the contextual awareness is because we live in a world now where there's such a diversity and broad spectrum of different contexts, different backgrounds people are coming from, and rather than it be divisive, it can be something beautiful and wonderful. But the key thing to keep in mind is that the context of something matters. And so until you really define that well enough, we make assumptions about when we hear somebody talk. Or, if you say this word, you think it means this, and it means something completely different. Now, Josh, I don't know about you. I know for me in my own marriage, I had to make sure that we define what some words meant, because they didn't mean the same things, and we only learned that after a lot of conversations and trial and error.
Arguments and misinterpretations, probably.
That's a better way of putting it, yeah.
Yeah, that's I think that's kind of how a lot of people find out that when you are growing up in your own family bubble, in your own little sphere, like families have different ways of talking to each other amongst themselves, and then with everybody in the broad spectrum of life. I noticed that at an early age that like when my dad and I were talking, we could talk a little different than when we were talking with everybody, and how even his demeanor changed. So it was like it was a different context. He was now you're basically putting on not really a show, but you are kind of presenting yourself to the world in a way that people want, everybody wants to understand you.
I think the nice thing about friendships also, or longer term relationships and families and things, there's certain things that after you spend enough time together where you just kind of, you understand enough where you can just flow with it. Or there's, I remember my grandparents where they could just look at each other and they would communicate so much. They were really dangerous when we played cards at the table because they were talking across the table and I had no idea what they were saying, but they knew exactly. Yeah. And so, but it was that understood context that made the relationships so rich and wonderful, and with that too, though, if to try to explain that outside of that, you kind of had to spend some time to say, this is what this reminded us of, or why somebody shared a laugh. It's kind of bringing them into the joke or into the story that way. I just want to give a couple different examples. I know that the story at the beginning kind of sets you on a different path as far as choose your own adventure as framing it. The reason why this is important is because not even just you drop into a story and you're adding your own context. But even terms that would sound the same or exactly the same have very different meanings to different people, depending on generation or depending on profession, for example. Like the term pink Cadillac. Now, for some people, they would think Elvis Presley, man, that was the most famous pink Cadillac in existence. And some people would say Mary Kay Cosmetics. Somebody slayed it in the network marketing world, and now they're driving a pink Cadillac around. Now, those are about as different as you can possibly be from one another as far as the types of emotions that it may elate from somebody, But it's the same thing. It's a pink Cadillac, and it means something very different depending on what generation you're in or what industry you're working in,
And I also think that maybe was a movie with Clint Eastwood at one time, wasn't it?
I think it was, yeah.
Dating myself a little bit.
That's okay. One of the funny things is when I went into service industries, and I had to learn the term POS. That's an acronym for point of sale. So it's actually,
Right.
like the register and stuff. Well, before I knew that, I always meant POS always meant piece of something. And so, the POS, I'm like, what are you talking about? I had a moment going like, I didn't know what you're talking about. And surely I don't think you're talking about what I think you're talking about. And I was right. They weren't. So I think with that too, I want to just frame a little bit about when you're understanding context, there's a couple different things you need to keep in mind. One is there's kind of your objective framework. This is where you're kind of reviewing truths and falsehoods. And what this does is it frames definitions and it keeps it impersonal. Because a lot of times where people have gone awry in conversations and it's turned into arguments, I can think of my wife and I specifically where, it was a conversation, and because we didn't, keep all the emotions and things out of it to define the context, it could have turned out better in some of those situations. But that framework allows you to review facts.
Right. And I actually had something like this happen to me just the other day, where a coworker of mine totally thought I said something totally different that I didn't say. I had this where we had not an argument, but more of a disagreement about something. And I said, well, you lied to me. And they took it extremely personal. It kind of went off the rails quickly because they didn't understand the context in which I was telling them that you had lied to me. And so just remember that too, that different people, like, they're coming from different perspectives, and they may take something you say out of context instantaneously, and then you have to kind of try to pull it back. So keep it impersonal, and it really does help.
And if you can define that up front as much as possible, it helps to at least mitigate misunderstandings on the front. I know too, when you set the context correctly, it also changes your understanding of the subtext. Subtext is defined as an underlying and often distinct theme in a piece of writing or conversation. And so sometimes where you're saying, well, they said this, and now you're kind of reading into the thing, or you're interpreting the theme differently because you have a skewed context. That's important because until you get that correct, you're not going to have a right perception of something. So some of that is just making sure that you are calibrated correctly and understanding all those different things.
Exactly. I mean, that happens in pretty much everyday life. I think anytime you hear something, and that was kind of the purpose of the question at the beginning, you hear stuff and you're formulating a vision in your mind, and especially in your mind's eye, about what this is. So you need to actually really understand the underlying context when you're looking at something or reading something, listening to something. Otherwise, you may get a totally different view of it, and sometimes that's on purpose. Like in a movie or in a book, they may lead you down a road on purpose, and that is a difference.
There is, and sometimes the motives are good, and sometimes the motives are not good. Obviously,
Right.
We've all run into situations like that. I know.
Yeah. So I mean, and then understanding context helps you empathize with others. Empathy is important. And I know that in our kind of like everyday busy lives, we do get off that track of empathy. To empathize with someone is to really help you understand who or what they are and how they got to their location in life, or in this situation, or just in this conversation with you, or just in this moment. So it's very subjective, but empathy is important.
The thing that I think about with this, sometimes, especially when you're talking about something that could be a hot topic, I think the default hot topics are, what is it, politics and religion? I think are the two.
Abortion.
Yes. And those words conjure up so many different feelings in people, and they're topics, but with them carry emotions, and people have their own sets of things that go along with it. So that's different than defining the terms as far as here's the context for kind of recalibrating or calibrating to, here's the framework and here's the constructs of things. This is actually so that this is how it affected the people, and whether or not you agree or disagree with how they have perceived or rightfully evaluated the context or against truth and falsehoods, what this does is you say, I can understand how you got there. And one of the best examples was, for me, I was at this event and there was a guy who actually had started this kitchen where he employed homeless guys, and taught them how to be a chef and culinary folks, and they do catering and other things. And, the reason why he did that is because he himself was homeless. Now, when you looked at this guy, like going, wait, you were homeless for a while? You didn't look like what I would necessarily immediately say homeless and something comes to mind, depending on what city or part of the world you live in. He shared the story about how he became homeless, and it really brought it very close to home, going like, you know what? If one or two situations in my life had turned that way, that would have been me. That wasn't defining terms or anything, but that's just like, oh my gosh, I totally could see myself in that person's shoes. And that's empathy, where you can see, I could see how you got there.
Exactly. I mean, and empathy is important. I know a lot of people, it's in our society, it's hard for people to actually, I don't think it's hard for them to feel empathy. It's hard for them to even just take the second to think about the other person, because once I'm done with this, I've got to do this, I've got to do that, I've got to do that. But like Brian said, it does help you to know how someone got to where they are, and also put yourself in that situation too, so that you can frame how to move forward with a conversation.
I think with the digital world, we're especially guilty, all of us, where we read something, depending on how media frames it, depending on the type of camera angles the person chooses or whatever, we have a very different idea about what something really was like to be there, or to have heard something, or why somebody said something. It's very easy to spin the context out of context, and all of a sudden now you have a very different perception of what it is. The thing too is that because in the digital world, you're not in the same physical space. So as much as like video and film and all those other kinds of things, you can see and do that, and you can even watch some people's dynamic going back and forth on like talk shows or something. It does matter that you are actually physically in the room together, where you're picking up how they shift their body a little bit that may have been off camera. Those things really matter.
Sure. And like Brian's saying, like, it does matter when you're on the internet, or you're reading comments, or you're reading something, you aren't getting the full context of the situation, for one, because the internet really doesn't have a tone to it. It's the tone in which we imply to it. So that's why it's important to, put yourself to empathize with somebody else. But when you are talking to somebody, like Brian gave his example of the story, which is actually a really moving story if you think about it, because for him and I mean, for us, we don't know what it's like to be homeless, but it could be just one or two different situations, and you could have got there.
Totally. The best thing I think we can all do is, if we really want to have a meaningful dialogue, and something that would not just kind of by default reinforce the things that we've believed or our views on things, once we begin to know we all have some blind spots in our contextual awareness, it allows us to be open to listen and to make sure that we are constantly evaluating, like a good detective would, is this truth? Is this actually something that we need to understand the terms by which this is being framed? One. And also with that, too, are we understanding the hearts of people about the impact those situations had on them to come to now? Those two things, remember, they're kind of held in tension, because they're both and yet the truth of a situation may be different than maybe what somebody had felt in the moment, but they're all important to know. The biggest thing that we can do is, with the beliefs that we've held and the views that we've held, a good, solid view and belief is open to criticism or open to another perspective, and maybe it'll change it. Maybe you will say, I've perceived this correctly, I think that's a valuable exercise to go through, especially with those around you that are different, that have a different background than you. That takes a little bit more effort to do, but absolutely believe it's worth the effort to put forward.
I think that's a good spot to maybe put a comma in the conversation, huh, Brian?
I think so, Josh. So until next time, this is Brian
And this is Josh.
for Curiosity Continuum.